Hi, this is a short video to highlight the differences in the Develop module between Lightroom 3 and Lightroom 4. So first of all, this is a raw file, a CR2 file from my 1DS Mark III Canon camera. And you can see I've not actually done anything but import the file into the library. Yet I have a few settings already in place. So if there is a default setting that you find you're going to time after time after time, you can make those adjustments here, and then once you have them set, so I'll play around with this a little bit, go to the develop mode and then set default settings. So once you do that, you have an option to go back to the default, or you can update to the current settings. And so that's going to take all of this information here and apply that to every new import. So here you can see I've got flash setting as the default. I mostly work in the studio with studio strobe, so that's appropriate. These are all set at pretty much the minimal requirements. I could have moved the black over a little bit, but a little bit of black is okay. I like a little bit of clarity, I like a little bit of vibrance. So update the current settings. And so now every time I import a raw file into Lightroom using that camera, it's automatically going to show these new settings for next time. Now it's not going to change anything that's already been applied. And so for this file, for example, so you can see it hasn't changed anything because this is already in the catalog. So a few tools that are different. The main differences is right here in these tools. So the way that it works, basically, exposure, you can go plus and minus 4 here in Lightroom 3, and if you have a raw file, you can actually bring back some of this data. So you can see here at 0 where it started off, I have a little bit of clipping in the highlights, and when I hold my mouse over to activate this, you can see I've got a whole lot of specular highlights here. This is a piece of metal. Obviously this is a little circuit board, and so it's probably okay to have those things go to white because there's not really any detail there. On the other hand, the shadow detail in between these bits, that's probably fine too. But because this is a raw file, I actually have a huge amount of latitude, and so I can bring this way, way, way over. And while of course it's hugely changing the dynamics of the image, it's not actually causing any sort of spikes that you see in the histogram, which is which is an indication of damaging the original pixels. You would definitely see that if it was a JPEG or different file type. So other than the exposure, which goes both directions here, tools here are pretty much 1 to 0 kind of thing. They're either on or they're off. And that works out okay. But they made some pretty neat changes in Lightroom 4 that it takes a few moments to get used to, but once you upgrade, I think that you're going to find that you'll like it. I'm going to pause and open up the same picture in Lightroom 4. Okay, so I made a screenshot of where we had this file here in Lightroom 3 for comparison. And again, I wanted to point out before we go on, exposure, brightness, and contrast are the only tools that really can go both directions. Presence tools are not really a part of that conversation because they always have. Now, exposure, recovery, Lightroom, and blacks are pretty much from 0 to 100, and that's the only options you've had. They changed things in Lightroom 4 and basically changed the name of these tools, but they basically made them all work in the same way as exposure. So here we have the same image in Lightroom 4, and first thing I want you to know, it looks exactly the same. Now why is that? The problem is, it's not really a problem, the way that they set it up, when you import a file from Lightroom 3 catalog into Lightroom 4 catalog, it's automatically going to keep exactly the same settings as you had in Lightroom 3. This is a compatibility issue. So in order to use the new tools in Lightroom 4, you need to zip on down to the bottom in the develop mode and change the process. So here it says 2010, that's essentially Lightroom 3. We want to change this to the current and change it to the current. Give it a moment to think about it. Go back up, and now all of a sudden you see we have the new Lightroom 4 tools. And the way that I've set up my camera default for Lightroom 4, and again it's the same thing, you can change these tools here and then set your defaults. So exact same setting. For this particular program, I set it up so I have +7 clarity, +10 vibrance. These are things that I always adjust anyways, and so as long as I have a little bit there, it doesn't matter exactly where I start off with, but it gives some ideas as to where I want to go. Now, this one, for some reason, it started off at a -33 contrast. Changing that to a 0 is going to make it look essentially like it did in the Lightroom 3 version. So what do we have here? Instead of having the recovery, fill light, and blacks, now we have the exposure changes the same thing, only now we can go 5 stops instead of 4. Go back to 0 there. Contrast goes minus plus 100. That's not really that different. But here, instead of having highlights and where we can change the recovery and bring some of these white values back, now the way that we do that is use the highlight tool, and we can go -100 or +100. So that gives us a whole lot more latitude than we used to have with Lightroom 3. Shadows the same way. If you want to darken them, go to the left. If you want to brighten them up, go to the right. Whites, a little bit different. Difference between highlights and whites are really the way that it affects the histogram. So I'm going to show you both of these side by side. Let me just make these out. So whites, if I go all the way up, see how the histogram goes? And look how it compares when you change the highlights. It's only affecting this particular one, whereas with the whites, it's much more of a shift of the whole histogram. That's a key importance for you to understand. And you're going to need to play with both of those in order to really get a feel for the way they work. And of course, this one here, you can also go -100, and blacks the same way. And the difference between blacks and shadows is essentially the same as the difference between highlights and whites. So here, let me just reset these all back to 0, and then you can see. So shadows, if I go all the way over, it doesn't shift the histogram all that much in either direction. It just really focuses on the edges, whereas with the blacks, it changes the dynamic of the whole histogram. So I hope that makes sense to you. It's one of the key differences here that we get in the develop module from Lightroom 3 to Lightroom 4. It's really added some nice new functionality to Lightroom 4, and it might be one of the reasons that you'd consider upgrading. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing your images soon.